We're continuing to monitor developments in Iran. This is the live shot of the flight radar showing the picture of what is happening above Iran. The airspace has been closed. As you can see now, there's currently no planes flying over Iranian airspace. I want to bring in now senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Dr. Alex Bristow, here in the studio. It's a pretty stark picture that, to me, seems to demonstrate that there is a lot of concern that there is a potential US strike imminent. We don't have any confirmation from the president. In your view, what options could he be considering given the rhetoric we've heard?
I think it's going to be a difficult target. I think because this has erupted without much forewarning, obviously the protests have been a domestic affair that's been started largely by shopkeepers and people dissatisfied with the regime. The US hasn't been preparing its forces in the region in the same way as it did around Venezuela for months in advance. So you haven't got that huge build-up of force that the US would usually have if they were preparing to do military action. Particularly missing, I think, are the aircraft carriers and the naval assets that you would expect in the region. Of course, the US does have bases throughout the region where you can deploy particularly air assets, and they have already started moving F-35 fighter jets, as well as some bombers into areas where they could be used against Iran. It doesn't look like the US has an option to put in significant amounts of ground forces. And what we know of Trump is that's probably not his modus operandi. It isn't what he feels comfortable doing. So if he has military options that he's considering, it's probably going to be a limited strike, probably to send a signal to the Iranian regime, the leadership, as well as the Revolutionary Guards, that they can't get away with using the levels of violence that they have against the protesters, that he means it when he says, if you start executing people, if you start using these levels of force, there'll be consequences for you.
Yeah, I've been listening to an analysis out of the US talking about the fact that he almost has set a red line for himself already by talking about if protesters had been killed directly by the regime, that he would step in and act, in the sense as he painted himself into a corner here, necessitating the need for US action. Is there an ability to de-escalate?
I think Trump is very careful to always keep people guessing, and I think that's part of his skill set, if you like. And he does like to test the boundaries by throwing out certain ideas and seeing how people are responding. He always says he's going to make his own decisions and he's going to do that at the right moment. And I think there's probably some truth in that. He will be taking counsel right up until the point that he makes the decision. I think Trump obviously does make regular comparisons to his predecessors. He doesn't have a lot of time for most of the former presidents of the US. He doesn't like Barack Obama. Barack Obama got a lot of criticism for the way that he drew a red line in Syria and then didn't follow through with it. Now that Trump has made certain commitments to the Iranian people, that they should continue protesting and they should expect a degree of US support. There has to be some level of US support, I think, from not to lose face. But that doesn't necessarily have to be military action. It could be, for example, forms of electronic warfare that would help them access the internet, help them to network and help them to continue their protests.
I think it was a good point to say that Trump often deliberately sends mixed signals. I remember before the B-2 bombers struck Iran's nuclear capabilities last year, there had been confusing signals as to whether he was going to strike or wasn't. Is that a deliberate strategy that we could be seeing now? This morning he was talking about, people aren't being executed in Iran. People took that as a signal of de-escalation. On the other hand, the actions the US military and its allies are taking is to remove key military personnel from bases that could be targeted.
I think you would need to pull the people out in order to give yourself the options, even if a decision hasn't been made. You would minimise the US force profile, take away the targets that are not hardened, minimise the number of targets that Iran has. Iran's capability to strike back against US targets in the region is diminished because of the military actions that Israel took last year, as well as the US. But I think the B-2 example was an interesting one because if I remember correctly, he actually set a timeline and said, I'm going to make a decision in, I can't remember, something like 72 hours, and then they actually ordered the strikes within that time frame. So he does like to keep people guessing, and I guess there is some valid military strategy in doing that. I would think if you're sitting in the regime leadership position in Tehran, you would be expecting there's a possibility of US military action at any time.
And what would you think of the potential that the Ayatollah might read the writing on the wall here, like we saw with Bashar al-Assad in Syria fleeing suddenly to Russia? Is that the sort of thing that the US would be trying to precipitate?
So look, I think most analysts who are deeply monitoring domestic politics in Iran and understand the regime would say that that is not really an option that Ayatollah Khamenei and those around him have. That the credibility of the regime would not be sustained if they left. Obviously, the Shah did lose control of Iran by fleeing and has not been, the Shah that fled in 1979 is dead now. His son has not been able to return. So the precedent there is if you leave, you lose control.
You're never coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Alex Bristow from ASPI, really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.